The Centre presents a new podcast, CBME and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Welcome back to CBME and You, a podcast about biomedical ethics. Now, have you heard of three-parent babies? Have you heard about creating an embryo from one person's DNA? Would more parents really be better? Today, we talk about assisted reproductive technologies with international expert Professor Glenn Cohen, the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Glenn. We've got a few icebreaker questions for you. And before we get to them, I realize that every time we have a new podcast guest, I forget to warn them about James's accents before we start. And more often than not, the guests get quite surprised. It's brilliant, though. Anyway, icebreaker questions. Coffee or coffee? Or if you haven't been to Singapore, what is your go-to coffee order?
So my first trip to Singapore coming, and this is going to be embarrassing to confess, but I only started drinking coffee about 2 years ago, and I don't actually like the taste very much. So I do this thing that people find horrific, which is I mix in a protein shake in the morning with coffee. So that's kind of my start of the day.
For the record, for the podcast listeners, Sinead has an absolutely horrified look on her face right now.
It's very efficient, but not what I think most coffee love. And I respect them, and I respect kind of their traditions. And I realize that this is not perhaps consonant with the cultural understanding of coffee. But maybe over time, I'll develop more of a taste and more of a sense of it.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do to get the protein down and get those gains, right?
Okay. That's what you got to do. And then there's ruining art and a good thing. Okay, just to clarify, which coffee do you have when you put the protein in?
I'm actually completely unfussy about it. We have like a little Nespresso machine at home, so that's usually what I do. So basically a pod of coffee that I make, and I mix in a protein shake to it. That's literally how I start most of my days.
Okay. There's one more question. Why did you start drinking
This
coffee?
is the important question the bioethics audience really wants to know the answer to. Go ahead, Sinead.
Oh, yes. Why did you start drinking coffee if you're just going to ruin it with protein?
It's a caffeine delivery system for me. I actually found myself falling asleep in a meeting and after a long transatlantic flight. And so I'd always had like coffee in the background as a break glass opportunity if I needed it. And I found about 2 years ago I needed it.
Okay. Well, look, to be fair, I didn't start drinking coffee until my 5th year of law school when I had to do a summer semester and an internship at the same time. And I was like, something's got to give. But here we are quite a few years later, and while you're here for ABN, I will make sure I get some special coffee grab delivered and we can taste test for you.
There we go.
Okay, excellent. Okay,
and I'll bring the protein shake. You can put it in.
James, you're not invited.
Best of both worlds. It's perfect.
Next question. What country do you want to travel to next?
I'm very excited for my trip to Singapore because I haven't been, but high up on the list also are Chile and India. Those are 2 places I'd like to go that I haven't been yet.
All right. So you're excited for Singapore. That's next week?
And so, yeah, I have to do it on my calendar, but I think it is next week. I think it's almost a week from today. Yeah.
We're looking forward to having you here. And I hope you have enough time to actually see you around rather than just stick to the conference. But yeah, that you might have to sneak out of one of the sessions.
I'll do my best to be surreptitious.
We'll put James on door duty. Last question.
On the lookout.
What's your go-to karaoke song?
So this might surprise people, but it's actually Johnny Cash, and it's the Folsom Prison Blues, in part because I think it's actually fairly easy to sing, right? So, I hear the train is coming, it's coming around the bend. And it's like not so characteristic in that I have never shot a man in Reno or anything like that, but I think it's just the idea of, I find it a good song to sing and people often know it. If it's a group, I might do more ABBA, but if it's just me up there, it's going to be Johnny Cash.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we love Abba here. Now, just so that, I think I know who Johnny Cash is, but he's the guy who's like, he sounds like he's kind of like mumbling in a southern accent all the whole time, right?
I'm not sure how the American music cultural institution would respond to that particular characterization. There's a film about him called Walk the Line. He's one of the greats of American country music, I would say.
Okay.
That's a very political answer, diplomatic
Okay.
answer.
Just to
We try.
Johnny Cash is he rock?
I think most people would call him a little bit more country, like a little more
Okay.
twang, like,
Like Matthew McConaughey. All right, all right, all right, all right. Sorry.
let's say Matthew McConaughey is an inheritor of the Johnny Cash tradition, perhaps. We'll say
Okay.
that.
It goes the other way around.
The Johnny Cash legacy.
There we go.
Okay, all right. Thank you for answering our questions. We'll make sure to add that karaoke song to our ever-growing Spotify playlist.
Listen to it, Folsom Prison Blues. It's a very, very good song. But anyways,
All
Yeah,
right,
it
all
sounds
right.
fun.
Okay, we'll do that. We'll do it in honor of you at our next karaoke session.
Alrighty. So, Glenn, you've done a lot of research on the ethics of emerging reproductive technologies. And there are a lot of terms here that I don't understand, like IVF and IVG, MRT, which sounds like a local reference, and you'll find out what that is. But it's got nothing to do with reproductive technologies. And ectogenesis. Just for our audience and for people like me, could you explain what some of these are, just, I guess, in brief detail?
yeah, I mean, IVF, in vitro fertilization, has been around the longest now, right? With the birth of Louise Brown, among others, many years ago. And this is the way many people today in many industrialized countries, and really around the world, have reproduction, in that we fertilize an egg with sperm outside of the body, and then we implant the developing embryo into the body to develop into a fetus and the like. That's pretty familiar to people. I think the others are less familiar. In vitro, in part because they're not widely available. In vitro gametogenesis, or IVG, is, and when I tell people about things I work on, this is always the thing that they think I'm making up, that it doesn't really exist, but we've successfully done this in many mammals and in human embryos. It's essentially taking adult cells like skin cells and deriving gametes, so sperm and egg, including cross-sex gametes, from adult cells. So that's in vitro gametogenesis. So we could derive sperm or egg from your adult cells, your skin cells, and use that to produce an embryo, implant it, bring it to term.
I can see why people don't believe you when you say that. That's
I mean, it
really
does sound
sci-fi.
rather science fiction, but it's quite amazing that we've been able to do this. Mitochondrial replacement involves putting together the mitochondria from one woman with the nuclear parts of the oocytes of the other parts of the genetic material together to produce an egg, which is fertilized by a man's sperm. So two genetic mothers, one providing the mitochondrial DNA, one providing the rest of the DNA, and a man's sperm, sometimes called three-parent IVF. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, or presumes an answer to an interesting set of questions. And then there are other things like uterus transplants, that we can actually transplant a uterus from one woman to another, ectogenesis, which again, so uterus transplants we have done and we're doing in the United States. MRT, which I just mentioned, is being undertaken in the UK and some other countries, but not the United States. IVG on humans, not being done anywhere at the moment. And then ectogenesis is the idea of kind of artificial wombs and generating kind of an embryo that could be sustained without implantation over a period of time.
This is incredible. I think I remember, well, I know that IVF is on the up. Like there's lots going on. I know that in Singapore, I Googled it yesterday. They're almost doubling their use of IVF every year, or every couple of years at least. And one of the interesting things that I've seen come out of the news, and obviously when you do something more likely to make a mistake, is that things go wrong in IVF. Like it used to be really, controversial. People thought, oh, how could you be making test tube babies, these sorts of things, et cetera, et cetera. We got used to it, and now some mistakes have happened. So in Australia earlier this year, it was announced that a woman had been raising a child that she had given birth to following IVF that was genetically unrelated to her and her partner or her husband. And it actually belonged to another couple who were trying to conceive through IVF. Now, the mistake wasn't realized until several years after the child's birth. And then once you start going down this rabbit hole on the internet, you start to find quite a few more of these being reported. There was a major one that happened in Israel. It actually made it to the Supreme Court. And honestly, everyone just sort of wants to know, who are the real parents? And I hope you can hear my finger quotations as an audience when I say the word real, because I can't think of a better word.
You could do who are the real parents?
Yeah, I'll do that next time.
So, actually, I wrote about the Israel case with two callers, with Vardit Ritsky from the Hastings Center and Shelley Samana, who's a professor at BC Law, while it was being litigated. So, first of all, just to give some context, we should also be clear that errors and mix-ups happen in non-reproductive technology cases. Believe it or not, there's case law about babies switched in hospitals and when to switch them back because sometimes the wrong baby is brought home. And so that's interesting to say that, there's something, while the cases of reproductive technology have gained a lot of attention, actually, numerically speaking, unclear what percentage of possible cases there. Okay, that said,
Wait,
how do
those mix-ups still happen? I thought that was like a thing of bygone times.
Again, there are switch cases. There are also cases of misattributed paternity. So there are estimates, for example, that maybe somewhere between 1 and 5% of individuals are incorrect about their paternity. And indeed, 23andMe, and I warned this about people who were buying these for families and for, a nice holiday or a present, like a stocking stuffer, that actually these genetic tests can often reveal really difficult things about a family. Actually, there's a book I edited a couple of years ago on consumer genetic testing, and there was a really remarkable chapter someone had written about their own life experience where I believe it was a niece who had undertaken one of these as part of a school project, 23andMe or an Ancestry.com test. I can't remember the details. And it basically revealed a long held family secret that the mother, I guess the aunt's mother, so the great aunt or the grandmother, excuse me, of the child in question who did the test was actually the victim of rape and had been the victim of rape at a young age. And this was something that was never addressed in the family. And the child was raised as though it was part of the family like every other child, but it turned out there was this whole part of the family tree that was not genetically related. And this was uncovered in this process. So this is just to say that the idea of complicated kind of mixings and secrets and things that are not clear at first to become clear is not specific just to the embryo mix-up cases. But speaking of the embryo mix-up cases, there's a few different ways you can think about the question about parentage, and I think about this as a lawyer as who is the legal parent. That's maybe the way I would phrase it, like which person is the legal parent in this instance. And one possibility, which is the traditional, is to do it on the basis of gestation and the marital presumption. So the idea is if you are the gestator plus the person who's married to the gestator, you are the legal parents. A second approach is to focus on genetic relatedness. A third approach focuses on the best interests of the child, and we can talk about all sorts of interesting problems about thinking about how that applies in the context of reproductive technology. And the fourth approach you could think of just theoretically is that actually, why are we trying to get it down to one parent or two parents? Why not recognize multiple parents? And there could be more than two. And what's interesting about the embryo mix-up cases is that in regular surrogacy cases where a similar question is raised, if a surrogate, a gestational surrogate, that's a surrogate who carries the child but doesn't contribute genetic material, if she's agreed to be a surrogate and then she changes her mind, there is this question about who gets to claim legal parenthood, the woman who provided the egg or the woman who did the gestation. And in the regular surrogacy cases, many courts are in favor of what's called the intent rule, that essentially we look to see who intended to be the rearing parent and we kind of contractualize this whole area or try to read in a contract. What's interesting about the embryo mix-up cases is that actually there is no intent because surrogacy occurs as a matter of error. And there's a way in which you can view, and some might find this offensive as a framing, but it's helpful conceptually to say, one can view the person who carries another rearing family or another genetic family's embryo as a kind of involuntary surrogate, somebody who ends up in the situation of the surrogate, but not by intention and not by agreement. And so now we kind of more nakedly face the question of, under that circumstance, we can't rely on the intent rule. We have to rely on one of these other things. And I'll just say one more thing about it is to say, you might be attracted to the best interest kind of analogy, which is something we often think about when we have a custody fight or questions about adoption. I think there's both a conceptual problem, which has to do with the application of best interest reasoning to an entity that doesn't yet exist and what effects that might be. And we can at some point talk about non-identity problem or stuff like that. But then there's also just a very practical question, which is to say, when you have an embryo, if you discover it in the course of pregnancy or shortly after pregnancy, how do you have any data about which of these parents would serve the best interests of the child, right? Because we often think about the best interest as being a very, contextual contextual kind of analysis, a lot of data about how a particular child relates to a particular parent. You've got none of that at the very beginning. And so you worry a little bit that the best interest analysis becomes a kind of fig leaf for all sorts of social prejudices or views we have about class or about resources or about who makes a good parent. So I'm not a particularly big fan of resolving the cases that way.
Do you think, though, that so I'm aware that when courts are tasked with determining legal parenthood, guardianship, custody, etc., their only jurisdiction is over parens patriae, so they can only make a decision in the best interest of the child. And I'm speaking from my understanding of the Australian court system here, which, you're right, limits it to questions about what is in the child's best interest, their well-being, what existing relationships are already there. And there's just something you said, which was that, when the mistake is discovered in womb, it's too difficult to make a determination about which relationship is strongest. But do you think that's biologically accurate insofar as, like the gestational relationship between gestational mother or progenitor, or whichever term is preferable here, and the fetus is actually much stronger than we realize at that point in time, particularly for the mother, who research suggests calls it a transformative experience?
Yeah, so I think it matters what we mean by relationship and what we mean by best interest. So it's definitely the case that upon gestation for 9 months, the biological relationship with the fetus is different from the person who merely contributed an egg. On the flip side, if you think about the rest of the life and kind of what kinds of connections matter and and there's a social and anthropological and sociological aspect to this too, in terms of how do we think about the social practice of parenthood. Years ago, I wrote a paper where, among other things, I pointed out that there are other cultures, I think like Malinowski's Trobriander Islanders, right, who have different conceptions about what contribution of parents are. And again, this is like vague memory, so I might get this wrong, but I'll try to remember off the top of my head. The idea that like mother's ancestral spirit comes in and father's job is to open up the pathway for that. This is the way sex is understood culturally and the cultural cognition of this particular culture at the time when Malinowski is writing. And you might say, what is our own folk psychology or cultural cognition around parenthood? And what is it that we think one contributes? And I would say we're a heavily geneticized sort of society, that we tend to emphasize the genetic ties as a cultural one. And, this is true even when it comes to thinking about surrogacy and the desire in regular surrogacy, contractual surrogacy in places where it's permitted, which is not everywhere in the world, to really kind of transform it into a conception of labor or employment, right? A special kind of employment, but yet an employment that has like a termination point. And I'll just say, and again, this is like, anecdata, but when you talk to gay couples who are trying to determine who their surrogate is going to be and who their egg donor is, and you ask them, what are your feelings towards these two people? And how do you think about these two people? With the egg donor, there's a lot of identification and a lot of attempts to kind of shop for traits. And there's a sense that like the decisions I'm making with the egg donor are really going to be extremely important. Whereas I think the surrogate is seen by many of them much more as a service provider, someone who has this limited role. In some ways, an analogy to the role of the physician, the fertility doctor, that they're causally responsible for this thing coming into existence, but it's not kind of this deep connection with who my child will be, depending who the surrogate is. Now, the interesting question for me is, it doesn't seem to me that's like metaphysically necessary, that one could imagine a flipped perception of the two, and perhaps there are societies where that exists. But it is, I think, deeply embedded in our culture that genetic ties are seen as very important. Perhaps because we are such vain creatures and we tend to think a lot about ourselves and our own genes, and such that the contribution of this other genetic partner becomes extremely important in thinking about this as a cultural matter.
Yeah, the issues of what is in the child's best interest is really interesting to me, both, as you know, on the metaphysical side, as well as on the more practical side of like, how do we know? So we'll get to the metaphysical side in a bit, because I want to get there. But also there's a practical side, and you've raised an interesting issue of like, this is at the very beginning of a child's life, or even before a child's life even begins. Like, how do we know which parents are going to be in the child's best interest? And you've raised an issue, the point that if we're just using genetics, well, it's not clear that that actually means as much as we think it might mean. But if we don't have genetics, if we're not going with genetics, is there really are we really left with nothing as?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm very skeptical of the best interests analysis as applied in this circumstance. And I guess here is sort of one of the reasons is you might think if your goal in life was for this child to live a flourishing life, why is it that you would bound your choices between being either the gestational mother or the genetic mother? One could imagine fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh other people out there in the world who would actually be even more in the best interest of the child if we took this seriously because of their outstanding parenting skills, their outstanding resources, whatever it is you matters to you. I'm trying to be ecumenical about this, but there's no reason to think it's merely these two people who are certainly the best of all possible parents. And if I say, well, why aren't those people allowed to have standing to make a claim to the parenthood of this child? Your answer would be, well, they're excluded because they don't even have the gestational or the genetic tie. So it seems to me when we talk about best interests, we're not thinking about it in a truly robust sort of way. We actually mean this as a kind of tiebreaker. And then if I say, as tiebreakers go, what kind of epistemic kind of advantage do I have in figuring out who is in the best interest and how much confidence do I have in that judgment? I think just early on, it's just such a rife terrain for stereotyping rather than sound judgments that I would just as soon not invite it. Now, of course, if somebody has reason to think that they're going to be an unfit parent or a terrible parent, well, one thing I point out is that those people get to at least start out being parents through coital reproduction all the time, right? We need to have some significant evidence before we'll remove a child from the care, right? So why is it that we're so quick in this space to jump in and think we understand what we can make predictions about best interests so well?
That's a really good answer. And I think
Yay,
it makes
me.
it makes me think. It makes me think, or question just genetic affiliation and the role it plays in determining legal, but also things like moral parenthood. But then that sort of questions the rest of the ART or assisted reproductive technologies that we're moving forward with, and we're trying our absolute best to develop. So we've got things like IVG, so in vitro
Gametogenesis.
gametogenesis, MRT, ectogenesis. All of this is doing our absolute best attempts to make sure that everyone has the best opportunity they can to have a child that's genetically related to them. And I know that this might come across a bit weird or judgmental, but do you think that this is kind of unfair in that we are spending so many resources trying our absolute best to make sure everyone can have a kid that's genetically related to them when many people can't even access basic reproductive care in the first place, and B, there are so many children out there who need homes or the whole foster adoption thing. And I know it's not a solution, but I think you understand my point.
Yeah, so let me cut it this a few ways. The first is, years ago I was very interested in, I have a wonderful colleague, she's now retired, Professor Bartholet, who is a big fan of adoption and skeptical about some reproductive technologies as a result because of the fear that this is pushing people away from adoption. So we tried to do an econometric analysis many years ago using the fact that infertility insurance mandates are introduced at various times in the United States to figure out whether when you make infertility care cheaper, do people substitute away from adoption? And we couldn't basically find a significant effect. So that's just an interesting empirical, it's one study. Econometrically, you could critique it. There's other ways of trying to measure it and the like, but that's, an empirical question whether people do or not. Second thing to say is if you are worried about children being available for adoption, as I think is a fair thing to do, it's unclear to me why you think the duty or the obligation to do something about that problem ought to fall amongst people who are facing infertility, especially if your view is about infertility, if we're talking about infertility, medical infertility, for example, about people who are suffering from a kind of disability. It seems like a strange logic to say we have the social problem, children in need of adoption. The correct person to put that burden on is somebody who's already disadvantaged. That's something else. So that's like a second cut at the problem. A different cut of the problem, though, I will say, so that's like pushing back a little bit. Pushing in the same direction, though, is to say many of these technologies, in vitro gametogenesis, mitochondrial replacement techniques, are substitutes for using someone else's gametes. So you can often, for the vast, vast, vast majority of uses you could imagine, A solution other than these technologies would be to use a gamete donor, a sperm or an egg donor, depending on who the parent facing who's causing the problem that would otherwise manifest without these technologies. Such that any defense of these technologies depends on some preference for genetic relatedness of both parents. And if you don't believe that there's any interest that's a weighty interest, I don't want to necessarily use the word right, but any rights claim or interest claim here that's quite weighty as a genetic relatedness, then I don't think these technologies make a whole lot of sense. But that said, then again, neither does necessarily some of the existing technologies that we have that we treat as more traditional, right? So I think there's this interesting question that culturally we do seem to assign a significant amount of importance to genetic relatedness. And whether we're willing to cash it out with a new wave of technologies, the way we've cashed it out with old waves of technologies as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that one possible view is just that, look, people have interest in having children who are genetically related to them, but they don't necessarily have a right to have children who are genetically related to them. And so it's kind of up to the rest of society how much subsidies or assistance we might provide. And if it turns out that we're willing to provide assistance up to a certain point, but not to the point of more expensive or more high-tech solutions, then that's just what it is, or something like that. So isn't that one possible view?
Good, but notice that your framing has compressed the conception of rights to compress all rights as being positive liberty rights, and that you might ask, what about at least the negative liberty rights here, right? So even if I conclude that your interest in genetic relatedness does not give you a strong rights claim to a limited pool of resources for support from the public, does it at least give you a negative liberty right against non-interference or a law prohibiting it? Because in most of the countries that exist right now, many of these technologies are not lawfully available. It would be a crime to engage in one of these practices. In the United States, because of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, if it's unapproved, it's a roundabout way that it would be kind of unlawful. So you might say, maybe I have no rights claim to resources for support, but I do have rights claims at least to non-interference and a negative liberty. I'll also just put out, though, that one of the interesting questions here, and this is the place where I think bringing it to the LGBTQIA community, or at least the LG community, is quite interesting, in that one use case for in vitro gametogenesis and mitochondrial techniques possibly too, but at least IVG, is cross-sex gametes that basically female-female couples could derive from one partner a sperm, and from the other an egg, and the sperm would come through IVG, the egg through regular egg retrieval. And so they might say that it's actually not merely an abstract claim to genetic relatedness, but a claim towards equality and towards recognition that we ought to be treated like every other parent, and that just as every other heterosexual parent gets to have both parties be genetic parents, we ought to have the same claim. Now, others, like my wonderful colleague Françoise Bélis, would say, no, that's completely wrong, and it's a perversion of the idea of what we're using reproduction for. But all of these questions, I think, do raise the question about what reproduction is for, what is the good of reproduction. And to me, it's like moral all the way down. There's no way to escape kind of these profound questions.
I was gonna, I was super interested in the way that when sometimes you invent a technology to address things that people with disabilities or diseases or illnesses or infertility, in this case example, when you address the issues they're facing, that it also widens it up for a bunch of other people who weren't necessarily considered like same-sex couples. But, going the other way with in vitro, again, in vitro.
Gametogenesis, yeah.
Gametogenesis.
IVG, just say IVG. Yeah.
IVG.
M&M-y.
I'm trying to do a favor for our listeners by saying the full name, but I think I'm doing them no favors because I keep forgetting it.
You're doing them favors by reminding them that it's really hard to pronounce, and it's okay that you can't pronounce it.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Wow, thanks. Going the other way, though, IVG opens up the possibility of solo reproduction. So technically, from my bone marrow, we could derive, induced pluripotent stem cells. I could create a sperm and an egg. Well, not me, because I'm not talented like that and I don't have the equipment. But then someone could create a child for me that's not a clone. It's not an exact copy or replica of my DNA, but it was, effectively reproduced from my DNA. Does this seem like a really great idea for people who simply don't want to have to partner in order to have a kid, or is this going down towards the more narcissistic route that you want to have a kid? I can't tell. Could you help
Yeah, I think
us
it's a
out?
very interesting case. I mean, the other one that I think is interesting is called multiplex parenting, which is going in the opposite direction. So, yeah, and just to explain this briefly, right, is that one could imagine deriving an embryo through IVG, and then from that embryo, basically taking 16 parents, so compressing a whole group of grandparents or great grandparents, and then deriving essentially embryos from each of them, right? Deriving embryos for that, and producing what would be one child that is the result of 4 generations of reproduction. If you got 16 people together, a single child,
So your
right?
grandfather
And
would also be your dad.
well, I mean, the idea here, I mean, I think it's just an easy way to describe it, this multiplex parenting, that we could have
Okay.
more than two parents. We could have multiple parents by engaging in kind of repeated forms of this technology. So you have, on the one
Hmm.
hand, both of these seem profoundly strange. The solo, the person who wants such exclusivity, they want to be only them in all sides. And on the flip side, the person who wants to produce a child, not with the regular two, but with 16. Now, if I say in between these two, why is two the magic number, right? Maybe three
Hmm.
with mitochondrial replacement techniques. Is it naturalistic fallacy that's doing the work, or is it something that we think is actually important? How much of this is connected to a particular narrative that procreation ought to follow monogamous coupling and a particular conception of what a life partner is? And is there a way in which these technologies are kind of liberating? Now, all that said, I also have a strange reaction to the solo case, and it does seem narcissistic and perhaps problematic as a desire. And one might think the person who wants this, they don't need reproductive technology, they need psychotherapy, right? The idea is to say they need to understand, like that's like a particularly understandable reaction. On the flip side, if it turns out this is a person who would not reproduce otherwise, now we get into the throes a little bit of the non-identity problem where we have to ask,
Hmm.
would the act of reproduction be harmful to the child if but for the permissibility of this act, no child would come into existence, such that we're talking not about replacing one child with another, but instead preventing a child from coming into existence. So to what extent any of these technologies or prohibitions on it can be justified based on concern about harm to future generations, or are there other non-harm conceptions? I won't get into the fancy philosophical lingo here, but
Oh no, let's do
non-simple
it.
harm-based conceptions that could do work for us morally as well.
All
Oh,
right.
since you brought it up,
James has been waiting.
so I know that you've written a little bit against certain legal restrictions in these kinds of areas where there's an argument that says, well, look, if we restrict this person from, let's say, solo reproduction, or we restrict this person from choosing one like path of reproduction, whatever that means, over another, it will be in the child's best interests in some sense. And you've kind of taken a position against that argument. Could you explain, I guess, in
Yeah,
like quickly as possible, I guess?
yeah, as quickly as possible. So here's going to be the quick version. So actually, let's use a simple case. So in the UK, for example, for many years, there was a prohibition on reproduction past a certain age, right? So if the sum of the age of the two reproductive parties is beyond a certain age, they couldn't use IVF. So that's an easy, straightforward example. When you ask people, why did you have this rule? One argument that was made was, well, if a child is born and their parents are much older or their parents die before they reach the age of maturity, that child is seriously harmed. Now, once you think about that for a moment, you start to wonder exactly what they mean. And to be clear, my work is about asking people to be clear by what they mean. And then when they actually say what they mean, whether what they mean now has the same moral force as they thought it did, as opposed to saying there are not good arguments here. So if your claim is that the child is harmed by being brought into existence, you need to have a counterfactual conception of what the non-harm state would be. And if the non-harm state is non-existence, because if I prohibit a woman at the age of 50 from reproducing because I'm concerned about harm to her offspring, the alternative would be that that offspring is not born. And that's at the core of Derek Parfit's non-identity problem. Now, there are other instances where you're actually talking about substitution, where it's not a question of no child being born, but instead replacing this child with another child. And that might be you can justify that even though nobody is harmed and nobody is made better off, right? Through what are often called non-person affecting principle approaches. But when I pause someone and say, when you say you criticize that person for having a child at the age of 16 rather than 20, what you really are trying to say is the world would have been better off had we replaced that nice child you had with this other child over here. Now all of a sudden that doesn't feel like a very easy and like completely we should all coalesce on that's like a clear easy thing to say as a moral justification for the outcome. Instead, it's quite complicated and has a lot of implications. So I want to just kind of expose to people that unlike when you're talking about best interest for an existing child, where that existing child's life would go better or worse depending on whether we allow a certain decision to take place, like an adoption. With reproduction, when we change the rules about who's allowed to reproduce, we might produce no child at all. Hard to argue that's in the best interest, non-existence in most cases. Or we're making arguments about replacement. And as Jan Narveson once said, we have many reasons to make children happy, but we may not have the same reasons to make happy children, right? They're very two different kinds of arguments with different kinds of moral forces, and in my view, different justificatory forces for legal restrictions on reproduction. That was a little bit long-winded, but hopefully it wasn't too bad.
It was very succinct considering the problem that we face.
So what you're saying touches on not a recent, but a 2017 case in the UK, the case of Evie Toombs. I'm sure you're aware of Evie Toombs.
So, I think at one point I was. Tell me more, yeah.
Okay. So for our listeners who probably are deep into the law of wrongful conception, Evie Toombs was, I think, 18 or 19 at the time of the case. Essentially, her conception was a kind of sad story. So essentially, her mother went to the doctor before trying to have a kid, asked the doctor, is there anything I should be doing to make sure that when I conceive, this baby is healthy? Specifically, she said, should I take folic acid? The doctor said, nah, you're good. You'll get enough in your diet, which was at the time wrong. It was a mistake. That the research was sufficient at the time to show that taking folic acid can drastically reduces your chances of having a kid with a neural tube defect. So the mother proceeded to conceive within the next week. And then wasn't told about folic acid until 3 or 4 months into the pregnancy. And the child was subsequently born with spina bifida or neural tube defect, causing some disability for the rest of her life. So she was 18 at the time of which she sued the doctor for wrongful conception. So this is the idea that you made a mistake and the mistake was prior to my birth or prior to my conception, and that was wrong. Now, courts have long struggled with comparing existence with non-existence, and for that reason, they have never awarded, as far as I'm aware, never awarded damages to the person because they say, well, you exist, and the alternate of the person not being negligent was that you would never exist, and that is worse for you. Well, we actually can't tell. But in the UK, they have a piece of legislature which says that people can sue for this, which is quite interesting. And it sort of bypasses the question of having to compare existence as someone who might be suffering a disability with non-existence. It sort of picks up on the idea that something did go wrong and someone has suffered. Whether or not we can compare that their life would, happen without that suffering, they are nevertheless suffering in this moment. And I found it quite an interesting bypass to the non-identity problem. The Parliament was like, yeah, we're just not going to deal with this and we'll just make it a statute anyway. I was wondering if you'd given that any thought or if you thought that was a good solution to this or a good regulatory solution anyway to the non-identity problem.
Yeah, so without speaking to the specifics of the UK case, which I'm not familiar enough to really speak with any authority, I will say a couple of things. First of all, one thing to say is that in the United States, wrongful life lawsuits are typically unavailable, but wrongful birth is available, whereby the parents might be able to bring a lawsuit. So one interesting question is, if you're worried about deterring misconduct, how much extra misconduct you deter by allowing the wrongful conception or the wrongful life lawsuit on top of the wrongful birth lawsuit, right? So you might already get closer to optimal deterrence. The other thing is to say, beyond non-harm or non-simple harm-based, person-affecting harm-based theories, you could believe again in this non-person affecting principle approach. You also could believe, and Shauna Schifrin has an old article on this subject in legal theory about this idea of what I would call wronging without harming, that we could have wrongs that are done without harming. I have to say that I've written years ago, I wrote considerably, thought deeply about this, that I'm not convinced, but it would be an one way to understand or possibly to justify some kind of penalty here or statutory damages is it acknowledges wrongdoing, even if it is harmless wrongdoing, or harmless in the sense that there is no comparative harm, that somebody is both made worse off and better off. And Schifrin's argument, one of the things that she says quite interestingly in this old paper, if I remember correctly, it's a number of years since I last read it, is that it might imply that actually all acts of reproduction are wrongful or are prima facie wrongful because they impose a harm, the harms of ordinary living, just for a pure benefit, right, coming into existence, because nobody is harmed by not being brought into existence. Such that actually the wrongful conception case might have much more in common with the average normal conception case in that it imposes both a kind of negative state and a positive state at the same time. And one of the things she says is that even if you thought prima facie all acts of conception are wrongful, if I remember her argument correctly, you might think that actually some of the wrongdoing is dispelled by the fact that in the normal case, a parent shares in that they're the decision maker to conceive, and they share in some of the things that when a child's life goes badly, as all our lives occasionally do, right? They're there for the child. And that raises interesting questions about family structure and the like. So another way of defending something like what the court has done is that it's an instance of, or the legislature, I guess, in the UK, as a case of wronging without harming. There are also people who are threshold deontologists about this kind of stuff, or think that there's some kind of threshold model. So I think the philosophy is quite interesting. One thing I find interesting is this is one space where the courts have actually been interested in something that resembles the non-identity problem, even though they don't cite Parfit. But the reasoning of the cases actually very much resembles what Parfit says in Reasons and Persons in some ways. So that's an interesting place where you would not have thought of all people, of all the philosophers in the world, that Derek Parfit, mad genius that he is, would be the one whose ideas would influence courts. But there's a way in which the same idea has seeped in the general kind of desire not to recognize wrongful life cases.
Yeah, I first learned about Shauna Schifrin's theory about like how you can harm your child just by bringing them into existence in grad school. I took a picture of that slide and sent it straight to my parents. It did not go down well.
Sheer antinatalist meme from my child.
I mean, I think that for me, and again, over the period of, I've been at this for about 18 years, I guess, something like that. Over the period, I think if you read my early stuff, I sound much more like a philosopher. And if you read my later stuff, I sound much more like a technocrat. And I think that's an interesting kind of personal development of the way I think about it. But I think the philosophical instincts remain helpful in the following way. If I ask you to try to hit a target, it's really important to know what the target is and what the target you're trying to hit is. And, there's all sorts of other professions in academia and the real world who can help you to hit a target once you identify what it is. But what philosophers do better than others is to really question and push hard on the idea of what the target should be. So before I can tell you what a good informed consent process is, I have to have a theory about what kinds of information are meaningful, why I want that information to be available to you, and the like. So I think for me, I often think, and this is what I tell non-philosophers about why they should be interested in philosophy, is that most of life and most of policy is if-then statements. If X, then Y. And the filling in the if X part, lots of parts of the academy and in the world do that. Sociology, economics, political science, they tell you whether a condition is met or not. But actually, you only know which if X to ask about when you know what then Y you care about. So the idea that we actually have to think a lot about what matters in order to form good questions, to me, is I think the best gift I ever got from philosophy.
It's an excellent lesson. I'll ask that the next time some relative asks me, what do you do again? Why do you do it? I'll try that one.
I think that's all we have time for today. James, do you have any final questions?
I do not.
After I've just said we don't have time.
I can't wait to hear your Johnny Cash renditions when I next see you. And thank you again for the time today.
Maybe at ABN we'll organize a little karaoke sesh.
Yeah, after the conference dinner. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Likewise. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBME and You, and be savvy.